Hi everyone. Today on Cattlemen Talk, we are going to be discussing a very serious issue that is happening in Klamath County. And we are going to be talking today with Sarah Liljefelt. Sarah is the Oregon Cattlemen's Association's Water Resources Chair, and she has been a great resource to us here at the association. She is also a lawyer who works on water issues in the Portland area with Schroeder Law Office. So hi Sarah, how are you doing today?
Hi, Robin. I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Doing great. Enjoying the summer and getting closer to summer.
Yeah.
So we've seen the Klamath Basin in the news a lot lately, related to water or the lack of water, and received questions from our members and our followers on social media about what is happening there. Can you give us a little bit more information, particularly lately, what's been happening in Klamath County?
Yeah, Robin. Klamath County is really in crisis, and the county and the basin, the water basin, they've all been in crisis for a number of years now, related to a number of factors. There's been prolonged drought conditions in the area, as there has been in most of Oregon and other states. There was the adjudication that came to a final decision in the Klamath Basin in 2013, at least with the first phase of that adjudication, determining really early priority water rights. There was a takings case between the Bureau of Reclamation and irrigation districts that resulted recently in a decision. There are Endangered Species Acts considerations for threatened and endangered fish species that affect water use in the basin. There has been efforts to remove some dams on the Klamath River that could reduce the amount of water stored and available for use in that system, and more. So there have been a lot of things going on in the Klamath Basin. There's not just one thing that has led to the Klamath Basin being in the news recently, but there have been a couple of things that have been the most recent news in the Klamath Basin. The first being a 20-mile tractor convoy and rally that happened last week. And that really had to do with the Klamath Project that's located down in the southern part of the Klamath River system in Oregon. And that project is a Bureau of Reclamation project that was established in the early 1900s. And the Bureau of Reclamation stores water to deliver to irrigation districts who contract with the Bureau to receive water. And so the Bureau each year does projections for how much water will be available to deliver to the irrigation districts. And it's based on a number of factors, some being just how much water is available in the system, but also the Bureau of Reclamation for a long time now has been of the position that because the Endangered Species Act doesn't allow the federal government to take any action that would harm or take a threatened or endangered species, that certain amounts of water have to be held back in the lake or have to be kept in stream as flows for those threatened or endangered species. And so going back a little ways, in 2001, there was an instance where the Bureau of Reclamation did not deliver water to the irrigation districts, and the districts filed a lawsuit saying that the Bureau of Reclamation breached their contracts with the districts to deliver water, but also that the Bureau of Reclamation committed a takings, meaning they took the irrigation district's water for a public purpose, for the fish, without just compensation to the irrigation districts and the farmers who use that water. And so in 2001, when this first happened, there were similar rallies. There was what was called the Bucket Brigade that you may have heard of. And so folks passed buckets of water from person to person going through the city of Klamath Falls to show the protest to what the federal government was doing. And so in the lawsuit kind of continued for a number of years on a number of different decisions that were part of that litigation. And in 2013, the first phase of the Klamath Basin adjudication occurred, where the Water Resources Department decided really early priority date water rights, including in-stream rights for the tribes. And so in 2017, the 2001 case finally came to a decision in the Federal Court of Claims. And I think it came to a really horrible decision, because what was ultimately decided was that the irrigation districts didn't have a compensable claim for takings of their private property because of those tribal in-stream rights that were determined in 2013. So the tribes before that time were not able to make calls for water, and their early priority in-stream rights were not yet adjudicated. So number one, the tribes' rights weren't adjudicated in 2001, and number two, even if they were, the tribes didn't make a call for water, and they couldn't make a call for water back then. So it doesn't really make sense to say that because there were those early priority water rights, the irrigation districts didn't have a claim for takings. It just doesn't make logical sense based on how water law works in Oregon. So that was a kind of gut-wrenching decision that came out in 2017, and then more recently, the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit upheld that decision at the end of 2019. So that, in conjunction with the Bureau of Reclamation again this spring saying there's not much water to deliver to the irrigation districts, that deliveries will likely cease in June or by the 1st of July. And another drought being declared again this year by Governor Brown. That kind of all culminated in another rally similar to the Bucket Brigade protesting what was going on, bringing attention to what's going on and the crisis that's going on in the basin, trying to urge folks to find solutions for both fish and farmers, bringing attention to this matter to our legislators and to the White House, and trying to find better solutions than what's going on right now. I mentioned there were two very recent things in the news for the Klamath Basin. That was the first. Another is that the Klamath Irrigation District filed lawsuits for the Oregon Water Resources Department to take control of the dam that releases water from the upper Klamath Lake, where water is stored for the project, and to stop the Bureau of Reclamation from releasing water for what the Bureau thinks it needs to do for the threatened and endangered fish species. And there's a lot of disagreement about what is needed in order to support the fish population, and whether the Bureau of Reclamation has been correct in its decisions about when to release water, how much water to hold back. In this instance, the Bureau was saying that a 50,000 acre feet flush of the system was needed, and it was just a huge amount of water compared to the allocation that the districts were going to be seeing this year. And so this isn't the first time that Klamath Irrigation District has filed this particular action, and it's really based on who has water rights. So the Bureau of Reclamation does not have in-stream water rights. It doesn't have water rights for fish protection. What the Bureau of Reclamation and what the irrigation districts have are storage and use rights for irrigation. And so KID's lawsuit is asking the court to say that what the Bureau of Reclamation is doing isn't allowed under the water rights that it holds, and that the Water Resources Department also is not doing their job in allowing these illegal releases of water, for allowing the Bureau of Reclamation to allow the project's water to flow downstream into the ocean. And so if this lawsuit is successful, it will really be a huge shift in how water is managed in the Klamath Basin, especially in the lower basin for the Bureau of Reclamation Klamath Project.
That's
So really long answer, and it probably doesn't even, touch the surface of all the things that are going on in the Klamath Basin related to water right now.
right, exactly. It's just so contentious down there. Um, so if we can anticipate water for irrigators running out by July 1, which is less than 30 days away, and the governor has already declared a drought in Klamath, then what are people who rely on irrigation to do? I mean, what's the next steps for them? Are they just expected to stop farming and stop agriculture down in that area?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we've been talking about the lower basin, the Klamath Project area. So the answer is a little bit different depending on where the irrigators are located. But, if we're talking about the lower basin, the project area in particular, some of the users within the project have private groundwater rights. So some folks can use their supplemental groundwater in order to keep irrigating. The benefit of the governor declaring a drought in the Klamath Basin is that allows certain types of applications for water use that aren't available in non-drought years. So one of the things that we see happening in the Klamath Basin when these droughts are declared is that certain water users file emergency drought transfer applications that allow them, if they have a well available to use, allow them to take what they would otherwise use from surface water from groundwater. And so they transfer their source of water temporarily just for that season to use groundwater instead. So there are some options available that way in the project. Not every user obviously has access to either a supplemental groundwater right or a well that they can do this type of emergency drought transfer. And so the other thing that we see happen then is a lot of folks applying for federal aid through the USDA. And so that's obviously not a great option, but some folks are stuck looking for assistance to keep their operations going when they don't have the water to support their crop or their cattle or whatever it is they may be relying on water for.
Right, that's interesting. That's interesting that they can have access to a different source or a different type of water depending on if it's a drought season or if it's not. So that's interesting to me.
Right. Normally in Oregon, you can't switch your source of water, right? You have a
Mhm.
water right. It's very particular to the source of water. And so you can't change like that. This type of application is very unique for drought circumstances.
You mentioned the Klamath Adjudication. Can you explain what that is and what the current status of that is right now?
Yeah. So adjudications in Oregon are required because of how our water right system evolved. In 1909 is when the state legislature enacted the Surface Water Code in Oregon. And so when that Surface Water Code was put in place is when we went to an application permit certificate system. So paper water rights. But folks were in Oregon using water before 1909. And in Oregon, we have a priority system under the prior appropriation doctrine. And so we have to manage and administer water rights according to priority. But we don't necessarily know who those early pre-1909 water right holders are, or even if they filed claims for those rights, they're not valid until they go through this adjudication process. And I mean valid in the way that they're allowed to use water up until their water rights are adjudicated, but no decision-making body has said, yes, we agree, those are the rights, those are the extent of your rights, etc. So it needs to go through adjudications in order to clarify what their rights are, when their priority date is, and all the other details that are part of water rights in Oregon. And so we have a two-stage adjudication process. The first being the Water Resources Department making an administrative decision about who has water rights, how much, the priority dates, etc. And then once that decision is made, it goes to the local circuit court in whatever county the water basin that's being adjudicated is located. And then the circuit court will issue what's called a decree at the end of a long process. And so there are many adjudications that have been completed in Oregon, but most of them are fairly small. The smaller ones go faster, as you can imagine. The Klamath adjudication is a basin-wide adjudication for the most part. There's a small bit of the Klamath Basin that wasn't included, but it's a very large adjudication, and this type of large basin-wide adjudication has not been done everywhere in Oregon. So I guess I would just preface what I'm about to say with the warning that, you know, this type of adjudication can and will in the future happen in more big basins in Oregon. And when they do, similar things that are happening here can happen in the other basins. So if you can imagine, if the Willamette Basin, for example, was fully adjudicated, there's small adjudications that have already happened, but not the full basin. It would also result in similar things to what we're discussing here related to the adjudication in the Klamath Basin. So the Klamath Basin started in the 1970s, and the administrative phase of the adjudication, which is where the Water Resources Department makes its decision about all the rights, the pre-1909 rights, that decision came out in 2013, so a really long time. And similarly for the judicial phase, it'll probably also take many decades. And so we are in that circuit court phase now. What's notable to take away from the Water Resources Department's decision in the Klamath Basin is that once the Water Resources Department issued its decision, early priority water rights could then be enforced for the first time. So everyone junior to those pre-1909 water rights could be regulated off if those senior water users made calls for water. And the most notable pre-1909 water rights that were issued in the first phase of the adjudication were time immemorial in-stream water rights for the Klamath tribes. And so those in-stream rights set in-stream targets on different reaches within the Klamath Basin. And then also the Klamath Project got a priority date of 1905. So the Bureau of Reclamation water that's being delivered to irrigation districts in the project comes with a 1905 priority date. And then there's a number of irrigation rights in the district, or sorry, in the basin, that are associated with the former Klamath Reservation that used to be located in the basin. And so there's a number of different ways these rights are categorized based on who owns it now, how it was established, etc. But in general, those types of rights are 1864 priority date. And so there are these really early water rights, and as you can imagine, once they became able to be enforced, those senior water right holders, primarily the tribes and the Klamath Project, started making calls for water. And in Oregon, what that means is the senior user calls the water master or sends a letter to the water master saying, we're not getting the water we're entitled to. And then the Water Resources Department investigates that call for water, and if it's validated, then the Water Resources Department starts shutting off junior users. And so typically what we see when the Water Resources Department regulates off junior users in favor of senior is that they're regulating off surface water users, because it's pretty evident in the circumstance of surface water that if you take water out of the system and you use it on your property, there's going to be less water in the system for a downstream senior user. And obviously there's return flows and there's different things that play into it, but in general, some amount of water is going to be consumed in your diversion and use, and then less water will be available downstream. Much more complicated for groundwater. And so here in the Klamath Basin for the first time, we're seeing the Water Resources Department regulate on a massive scale groundwater users in favor of these surface water calls. And so it's just a really unprecedented time for water regulation in Oregon, and how the department is handling that and the effects on the region. And so when I talk about regulation off of groundwater, now I'm kind of talking about the upper Klamath Basin as opposed to the lower basin, because those the senior project rights are in the lower basin, but everybody above in the system, everybody who is upstream, so to speak, are the folks who are going to be regulated off. So the Wood River, the Williamson River, the Sprague River, the folks in those sub-basins are the ones who are mostly affected by these shutoff orders. And I mean, folks along the upper Klamath Lake too, as well. And so the adjudication, like I said, is now in the judicial phase, and it's very likely that there will be some modifications to the Water Resources Department's decision. There's already some indication that the court may find that the Water Resources Department applied the wrong standard for deciding tribal rights in the basin. And so if that were to occur and it was decided that too much water was awarded to the tribes, for example, then there could be some relief to other more junior irrigators in the basin. But it's many, many, many years away until the judicial phase is wrapped up. And so what we're seeing are folks wondering if they can hold on until a possibly more favorable decision is ultimately reached. I mean, you can't continue farming and ranching in the basin without water. And if you're looking at decades of the type of regulation that we've seen since 2013, you know, the situation is looking really bleak. And so we've also seen a lot of property owners applying to the county for variances for their land use designations. So if they are zoned as exclusive farm use in Oregon, they can't put in a solar farm, for example. And we've seen folks applying to the county to change or to get a variance in their land use so that they can put up solar panels, because if they can't irrigate, what else are they going to do with that rural property that's been used for agriculture for so long? And so the tractor convoy and the rally in Klamath County was really about the way that the Bureau of Reclamation project water is managed, but that's not the only area in the Klamath Basin that's really having trouble. It's also the upper basin that's getting shut off in response to these calls for water each year. And so that's that's kind of the
Yeah.
status of the adjudication.
So it's definitely not just one issue. It's not
No.
just, it can't be all kind of put under one umbrella. It's under a few different umbrellas there. So
Right.
as far as the adjudication goes, or as far as the senior junior water rights, does that come down to tribal rights to water versus agriculture mostly? Like, is that where the real contentious issue is happening there? Is the tribe really having a lot of pushback for that?
Well, I don't know that I would personally phrase it as agriculture versus the tribe, because this is kind of just the way that the priority system works in Oregon. I don't think that anybody denies that the tribe has these early priority water rights, that they're entitled to have their water rights adjudicated and validated, and that is not the issue I think that most people have. I think that the long delay in these giant adjudications causes a lot of trouble. The Water Resources Department didn't adjudicate this basin and many others throughout Oregon. We're not close to done with adjudications. The Water Resources Department hasn't adjudicated these water rights, and in the meantime, junior water users come in and rely on the water because the Water Resources Department issues them permits and certificates and says, yes, water is available for you. And then, sometimes 100 years later, then you're told, no, you don't get to use the water anymore. And it's just the way the system is, but it also makes it really difficult for folks who have relied on the water that the department told them they could appropriate. And the issue is also how the department is managing the senior and junior water users in the basin. Like I've mentioned, the way that they are regulating hasn't been done really before. And so we're looking at a situation where how water rights are administered has changed. And perhaps this is the way that we can predict things will go for other areas in Oregon. I don't know, that's yet to be seen, but this isn't the historic norm in Oregon. So, water users were totally unprepared for what's come out of this adjudication. And I think also, the issues that are being raised in the judicial phase of the adjudication, the standards that the Water Resources Department applied to award tribal rights. There's disputes about the science, about, what do fish need to be successful and thrive. So there's a lot of issues that people disagree about. There's a lot of issues about new methods for administration of water in Oregon. And so I don't look at it as tribe versus agriculture so much as a lot of other things that have just created the perfect firestorm down there.
Right. Gotcha. So let's circle back. I know you mentioned wells and that they're shutting off wells and that that's not a common practice. Why is the department doing so in the Upper Klamath Basin since the adjudication?
Well, so water in Oregon, surface water and groundwater, are conjunctively managed. And so it's not uncommon for example, for a groundwater permit, or I guess I should say application for a permit to be denied based on there not being enough availability in a connected surface water source. So there is precedent for managing the two sources of water together. But what we haven't seen before is large scale groundwater well shutoffs in response to surface water calls for water. And so just to put that in context, it was about 140 groundwater wells that were regulated off in the Upper Klamath Basin in response to surface water calls for water since that first phase of the adjudication came out. And that's like an annual shutoff, right? And the number has differed because the department has handled the regulation differently year to year, which also hasn't helped. But I think the maximum number in particular years has been about 140 wells. And so, you've got a conjunctive surface water groundwater management system. And then there's a 3-step process for regulating off groundwater in response to surface water calls for water. And so in that 3-step process, the department determines whether there's hydraulic connection between the groundwater source and the surface water source, which is usually always a given, because the department kind of takes the position that no water is totally isolated in the scope of the hydraulic system, rather than looking at it more from a perspective of, will the groundwater use affect the senior surface water user in that irrigation season? And so hydraulic connection is always kind of a given. But then the other two steps are, does the groundwater use have the potential for substantial interference with the surface water source? And finally, will regulation of the groundwater use result in timely and effective relief to the surface water user who made the call for water? And so you have a really complicated hydrogeologic system in the Klamath Basin. There are multiple confined aquifer layers. There are places where you've got a clay layer hundreds of feet deep, and there are many faults and springs as well. And so it's just a really complicated system. But there are certain aquifers that are very confined and isolated and don't have a lot of connection with the surface water, because there are in the upper basin a number of artesian flowing wells. And so, I mean, I have a client who's got a well that flows without pumping at 800 gallons per minute. So, I mean, some of these aquifers are under substantial pressure underground, which only happens if there's a very, very good confining layer that keeps the groundwater separate from the surface water. So, you know, it's complicated. I'm not going to say it's not, but the Water Resources Department has utilized tools to try to determine when it should shut off groundwater wells in favor of surface water. The first tool that they used was this type of analytical model that was basically a long math formula that helps predict stream depletion caused from well pumping. The problem was that the department was putting in inputs that were incorrect. And so it resulted in over prediction of stream depletion caused by these wells. And then after a lot of litigation, the department changed its rules, its administrative rules, and switched to a different model. But that model was based on a regional groundwater flow model and was not particular at all to any particular well. So you couldn't tell if a particular well was causing stream depletion. So more litigation. And then the department kept changing its administrative rules. And so ultimately litigation was dismissed as moot because the rules kept changing and you couldn't pin the Water Resources Department down on the standards that the court should be looking at. And then the most recent rules that the Water Resources Department passed kind of put regulation of wells on a hold for a couple years, only regulating wells that were in 500 feet of a surface water source, which also doesn't make any sense because they could be close to surface water but drilled 500 feet down and, really remote connection again. And so then you ask, well, does it really provide timely and effective relief if that water wouldn't reach the surface water for a millennia anyway? So that was also challenged in litigation, and finally a decision was made that the Water Resources Department didn't have authority for its most recent administrative rules. And so those rules were supposed to be in effect for this year as well, but the court case said that they were improper. I would expect that the Water Resources Department would appeal, but what's happening this year, I'm not really sure. I don't know if the department is going to kind of put regulation of groundwater wells on hold while they engage in new administrative rulemaking. That was kind of the plan anyway, because this new rule expired after this year. But I don't believe that the rulemaking process has started. And so we'll see about what's going to happen as more regulation gets going. As far as I know, the only sub-basin that's been regulated so far for surface water is the Williamson sub-basin. That's all I've seen so far anyway, but I don't know if any wells were regulated in that particular basin yet. And so I think everybody's just kind of waiting, seeing, and hoping that the rulemaking that's going to need to occur doesn't go as badly as the last round,
Right.
last couple rounds.
Well, thanks for expanding on that. I think there's so so many different layers that we can focus on little pieces. It helps, especially on the wells like that. So I guess to just kind of wrap up on a larger, broader view, what can agriculture agencies such as OCA, I know we have been working on these issues with you and attorneys like yourself, what is the main focus right now when it comes to agriculture?
In the Klamath Basin,
Yeah.
you know, there's no 100% clear solutions. I know that OCA and some local legislators have tried to bring forth positive legislation that would set forth more standards for how the department is regulating and response to these calls for water that would bring a lot more transparency and clarity and science into the mix. So far, those haven't passed through the legislature, but that doesn't mean we should stop trying. And also, there have been some attempts by the tribes and members of the legislature to this is another topic, but I won't delve into it for too long, but there's been attempts to get rid of the automatic stay provision that's in the law right now, where if you challenge a regulation order, the regulation order is stayed while you seek judicial review. So if you think the department was wrong on regulating you off, basically the department just has to issue an order with no kind of due process before shutting you off. And so the stay provision is sort of a due process safeguard that allows you to get a court to review the agency's shut off order before you're required to shut off. And so there's been attempts to remove that from the law or severely hamper that safeguard. So I know OCA has been very involved in ensuring that doesn't happen, as well as other organizations and other attorneys, because that's a really important procedural safeguard here. And then, there's been ongoing litigation. So, nobody likes to litigate. It's expensive, it's stressful, people avoid it at all costs. But what do you do when an agency is doing something you think is so wrong? You have to challenge that. And so there has been a lot of litigation in the basin. And, if the Water Resources Department ever stops changing the rules on us, maybe we'll be able to get a good decision and pin them down a little bit about what is allowed and what isn't.
Mhm.
So I think that's a hope for a lot of water right attorneys. Um, and just continuing to be involved. There's usually a lot of meetings that happen. The Water Resources Department holds a lot of meetings as they go through new rulemaking, or they try to roll out new plans for how they'll regulate. So I know the landowners down there have been super involved in that. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the comments sometimes fall on deaf ears, but that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile trying to make the agency understand the issues with the different ways that the agency is going about its regulation duties and authority down there. So, keeping involved is really important, and engaged as we go through the next round of rulemaking, which should be happening any time now.
Yeah.
You would hope.
We would hope, yeah. Well, that's good to hear, and it's such a long, drawn out process. I mean, it sounds like it's been going on for years and years. So slow moving, but it's good to hear that people are still very focused on it, and associations and legislators are still really concerned with what's happening. So because this is such a long, drawn-out process, what's your projection over the next year for people who really rely on irrigation? It's in agriculture in their livelihood. What's your suggestions? What do you see happening over the next year?
Man, that's so up in the air right now because of the administrative rules not really being in place to tell us how the agency is going to regulate. Um, you know, what I can tell you is that nothing's going to be resolved in the adjudication in the next year, right? So the water rights that were decided by the Water Resources Department are still going to be enforced. And so those early priority water rights, even if there was a mistake in calculating the amount, that's what's going to be enforced up until the adjudication may be revised in a final decree. So that won't change. What is changing year by year is how the Water Resources Department enforces the priorities that, so, you know, we kind of have to wait and see how the administrative rulemaking will go. As far as the lower basin, KID has gotten farther than they have in previous years in getting the Bureau of Reclamation to stop releasing project water for fish, or for what the Bureau thinks is needed for fish. And so it'll be really interesting to see if a decision gets made, if an injunction gets issued. If that happens, there'll be a huge shift in how water is distributed and administered in the Klamath Basin. And so that will be something to really watch in the next year. Yeah.
Definitely. So my last question is, of course, the rally we know happened just a few weeks ago down there, and that's one way to show protest. And you mentioned the bucketing water, which is, I think that's a great visualization of what
Yeah.
people really need to rely on. What are your other suggestions for people who want to become involved or want to have their voice heard on this issue?
If we're talking about individuals, I think what I've already mentioned about looking for any meetings that are happening, making sure you have representation in the rulemaking process. So I believe that OCA will have a seat at the table, so to speak, and so our members will be able to talk to OCA about what they think is important. Farm Bureau as well, I would think would. And so staying involved with those organizations and making sure that your voice is heard when drafts of that rulemaking come out. Staying in the Klamath Basin adjudication, meaning, not dropping out and giving up if you've got claims or contests, because someday you are going to get a decision, right? It won't be in the next year, but, they're making slow progress through the courts. And I guess another thing that has been tried in the Klamath Basin is coming to some sort of settlement or compromise. So far, negotiations about, for instance, the tribe not making calls in exchange for funding and some agricultural lands being fallowed. That was one attempt. I mean, those are broad strokes of a much more detailed settlement that folks tried to reach down there. But there were attempts to try to work out the water situation so that irrigators would have water and the tribes would have some benefit to not making calls for water. So that was the general framework. And so there could be opportunities like that in the future. Those settlement talks sort of ended when Congress didn't provide the funding that would have been needed in those agreements, but there was also a lot of conflict between the different users about whether that was a good way to go. So I would think that broader consensus would be needed in the future for anything to be successful. But, there could be opportunities for that type of compromise in the future. And, that would be a much more happy story, I guess.
Yeah.
People coming together to agree, because right now, it is a lot of litigation and conflict.
And like you said, no one really wants to be involved in litigation. It's so expensive and takes so much time and effort. And I do hope that in the future people can find common ground on this and that we can move forward together. Well, thank you, Sarah, for coming on and talking about this.
You're welcome.
Such an important issue to so many people, especially down in that area. And I think it's going to have a long-term impact on all of Oregon's water, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
So hopefully if there are any updates or any news that happens, you can come back on again and let us know how that's going.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you for having me on, and hopefully next time we talk, I'll have more positive news to share and not so much depressing news.
Oh, yeah. We hope. Well,
Yep.
thank you.
Thanks.